Okay, I think we're going to get started. It's 9:30, can be early on a college campus, so I suspect we'll have a few more people rolling in. I know we have lots of people watching online as well, so there are a lot of people virtually in the room as well who are interested in hearing from Adam. My name's Jason Bordoff. I'm on the faculty here at the School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'm really thrilled that Adam Sieminski could be here today. I consider myself very lucky to call Adam a friend, but also lucky whenever I get a chance to spend time with him because of how much I learn about what's happening in today's energy markets. Many of you know Adam, but just by way of brief introduction, he's had a long career as an energy market analyst, serving from 2005 to 2012 at Deutsche Bank as their chief energy economist. Before that, for about 7 or 8 years in a variety of other senior leadership roles in their oil and gas equity team. And then left in 2012 for a 10-year time in public service, joining the staff of the National Security Council, where he and I worked together, and then leaving the NSC for bigger and better things when the Senate confirmed him and he was sworn in June of 2012 as the administrator of the EIA. And for those of you like me who are energy nerds, you know how invaluable the EIA is. Whenever I have students who say they're interested in energy, I say one of the first things you need to do is get very comfortable with the EIA website, because you're going to spend a lot of time there. But Adam's really done, I just want to say, phenomenal work over the last 2 years to modernize and expand EIA and make sure that its capacity is keeping pace with how dramatically the US and global energy landscape is changing. And it's too many examples to go through here, but I think one of the first steps he took when he got in was making sure EIA was tracking Brent, not just WTI, to reflect what was happening in the global market and what was actually affecting gasoline pump prices. Since then, the EIA's drilling productivity report has given us much better information about the productivity levels and decline rates of unconventional oil and gas wells. Much better job to collect data on the movement of oil by trains, something EIA didn't do before because we didn't need to do. But if you look at the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning, you're reminded of how important it is for the public and policymakers to understand how much oil we're moving by rail. Expanded mapping capability, a new interactive coal data browser to give us much better and timely information on how coal is being used, supply and demand for coal, and not just oil, gas, and coal, but better information on electricity, on efficiency, vehicle demand and miles traveled, and a whole host of other aspects across the board. So the capability of what EIA is doing is just expanded dramatically. And all of that is really critical, not just to helping the public understand what's happening in energy, but to making sure our policymakers have the information that they need to make good policy decisions. So on behalf of all of us who use EIA data and also care about good policy decisions being made, I just want to thank Adam for all he's done for serving in public life, for all he's doing in the administration right now, and for all he's done to increase the capacity of the Energy Information Administration. So please join me in welcoming to Columbia EIA Administrator Adam Sieminski.
Jason, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I appreciate it. I remember distinctly all of the efforts that we were making on the National Security Council staff back in 2012. I don't think I thought I worked really hard when I was on Wall Street, and I was amazed at how hard and conscientious the work of the National Security Council staff was, and Jason was a huge part of that. The purpose of today's talk really is to go through some of the key conclusions from our 2014 International Energy Outlook. Now, this is a kind of a reduced version. We only covered the global oil markets in this one. In 2015, we will return to a full all energy sources and uses around the world version of the International Energy Outlook. We are kind of splitting every other year full versions of the U.S. Energy Outlook and the International Energy Outlook. And because we're doing that, what that allows us to do is actually put more people to work on the International Energy Outlook, which I think is terribly important given that, as you will see in some of these slides, a huge portion of the world's demand growth, certainly in oil, but in fuels in general, is going to be coming certainly outside of the United States and even outside of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, developed countries. So let's just go through these takeaways really quickly. We looked at 3 price scenarios. We examined a range of interactions of supply and demand and prices in the global markets. One of the things that we found is that we think that the tight oil or shale oil phenomenon will spread outside the United States, and that could add as much as another 3 million barrels a day to global oil production by 2025. We also revised our projections of Mexican oil production in view of the recent legislative changes in Mexico, the reform in the energy area, which we believe will allow for more capital investment and greater application of technology. Some of the conclusions that come from our reference case, and keep in mind that the reference case is something that EIA uses and not everybody does. Our reference case is based on existing law and regulation. So we don't try to project or forecast changes in law or changes in regulation. In many forecasts, they actually do try to do that. The International Energy Agency, for example, will take into account what they think will happen legislatively and from a regulatory standpoint. We try to stay out of those arguments. I think it helps to preserve EIA's independence for us to not try to say what we think changes in law will be. But we can address those issues through side cases. Now, the side cases will take into account how things might evolve differently than the reference case. And so then what's important is not really necessarily the end point of the projections, but rather how the reference case and the side cases or alternative cases look in comparison with each other and what the difference is between the two. We found in our reference case that world petroleum and other liquid fuels use would increase by almost 40% between the base year 2010 and our final year in the projection of 2040. All of that increase in liquid fuels is in the developing world. Developing Asia, and particularly China and India, as well as the Middle East, account for something like 85% of the increase in petroleum and liquid fuels. Increased demand would require an additional 33 million barrels a day of liquid fuels that would push us up to 119 million barrels a day of use by 2040. Within that, OPEC crude oil and least condensate increases by 14 million barrels a day, non-OPEC crude and least condensate by 10 million barrels a day. Other liquid supplies, including things like biofuels, the gas to liquids, coal to liquids, refinery gain, natural gas plant liquids grow in importance, supplying something like 17% of total liquids production by the year 2040. So let's just drill down into some of these things, and we'll start off with a quick review of the reference case, price forecast for Brent crude oil, as Jason mentioned, as well as a low price case and the high price case. The reference case, we have prices dipping down below $100 a barrel. It's actually, we're below 100 today, but then climbing slowly towards about $140 a barrel by the year 2040, and those are in 2012 dollars. The low price case hovers somewhere in the range of about $70 a barrel, and the high price case, as you see, moves up very sharply, surpassing $150 in the next decade from this one, and then moving up over time. In the reference case, almost all, as I said, the liquid fuels consumption occurs in the emerging non-OECD nations. So there you see developed world demand essentially flat, non-OECD climbing pretty strongly over the entire forecast period. Drilling down into that, non-OECD petroleum and liquid fuels consumption, so this is, again, the reference case. A lot of the growth really coming from the other Asia, Middle East, and China blocks there at the bottom. Dealing with the policy implications of that is going to be, I think, a challenge for the policymakers, not only in those countries, but outside as well. And maybe we can get into a little bit of that in Q&A period. China, India, and the Middle East leading the liquids demand growth. You see China by far the most important growth area into the 2025 and 2040 period. India climbing pretty steadily and coming up pretty strongly in the Middle East as well. In China, it's largely driven by economic growth. In the Middle East, it's a combination of economic growth and relatively low prices for liquid fuels, where there tend to be state-sponsored subsidies in a number of those countries. One sort of just interesting factoid with U.S. liquid fuels demand flat to down over that forecast period. Chinese growth relatively steady upwards. Sometime around 2035, we expect that China will actually be using more oil and liquids than the United States. So China's total energy consumption is already higher than the U.S., but by 2035, their oil consumption will be larger than the U.S. in our projections. There is another area of fairly strong growth in the International Energy Outlook, and that's liquids used in electric power in the Middle East. We actually think that that number will shrink over time as other fuels, especially natural gas, begin to get used in the Middle East for generation of electric power, but it's still going to account for a significant share of the world's liquid fuels consumption. In our reference case, we compare against the reference case a low oil price case and a high oil price case. And here you see the non-OECD and OECD components on demand and how those components shape up on the supply side between liquids, other liquids, and then non-OPEC and OPEC. Remember that other liquids category is largely things like natural gas plant liquids, biofuels, gas liquids, and so on. Now, what we found was that the supply composition changed more than the demand composition numbers with changes in price. So although changes in price influence the demand numbers a little bit between the high price case and low price case, most of the differences between those two cases show up on the supply side with less supply as coming from OPEC in the high price case, because non-OPEC supplies react very favorably to higher oil prices. So OPEC gives up market share in the high price oil case. Now let's look at the reference case and how OPEC and non-OPEC numbers shape up. There's an interesting situation that OPEC, I think, is going to be confronting over the next few years. Growth in production in places like the United States and Canada are adding significantly to petroleum supplies in the near term, actually putting some pressure on OPEC's market share, and that's that slight decline you see into 2015, 2016 in OPEC's output, with the pickup in global supplies, but particularly outside of OPEC since the 2010 numbers. Then there's a period where the OPEC numbers are picking up, but they're pretty much in line with the growth in non-OPEC supplies. Then you get out past 2025, and in our forecast projections, OPEC's market share actually has to climb faster to meet overall demand growth because of what we see as a slowing of non-OPEC supplies in the period after 2025. There's an interesting dilemma in here, in a sense, for OPEC. In the very short run, their market share is being eroded. In the nearer term, let's say 5-year outlook, there could be a lot of competition between Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia for market share. But in the long term, OPEC's overall market share has to grow pretty strongly, and that is going to depend, I believe, on these 3 key countries, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, to generate production increases to meet global demand, as we see demand continuing to grow in China, India, Middle East, and so on. So a question that I think policymakers will have to address will be how to maintain capacity or the potential for supply growth in OPEC in the near term, in order that when the world does call on OPEC for greater market share, that they're actually capable of producing it. So how in the near term, when market share is eroding, will OPEC be able to maintain the kind of production capability that will be required in later years? A lot of the growth in OPEC crude and least condensate obviously is centered in the Middle East. North Africa, relatively flat. West Africa climbing a little bit. South America climbing a little bit. Venezuela, assuming this is, long-term forecasts out to 2040. That growth in the Middle East is going to end up being split largely between Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and that's kind of what I was referring to earlier. Managing that will be a challenge for these 3 major producers. Outside of the OPEC countries, a lot of growth is expected in Canada, in the near term in the United States, but in the longer term, we actually have U.S. production beginning to come down after 2025. Whether that really happens or not is going to depend on a lot of things: what the resource base for shale really is, how technology improves. But based on what we know now about the geology and technology, we think that there will be strong growth out into the middle part of the next decade, but potentially leveling out, possibly coming off a little bit then. Mexican production coming up now in our long-term forecast, rather than what we had over the past few years in the IEO projections, which was continuing deterioration. Pretty decent growth in Brazil and Kazakhstan, even in Russia. Those are the major areas of growth. Back to Canada and the United States for just a second. In the U.S., I think a lot is going to depend on what the nature of the resource base for shale oil really is. In Canada, a lot will depend on Canada's ability to continue to produce from the Western Canadian sedimentary basin, the oil sands in Alberta, and export routes for that oil. In Mexico, it's largely going to be dependent, I think, on how well energy reform really continues. We're fairly optimistic at EIA that it will progress and that these numbers will go up if if Mexico does succeed in moving forward on this, bringing foreign capital in, not just for offshore development, but reworking some of the onshore fields, possibly even getting at some of the shale oil and gas resources in Mexico itself, those numbers could climb and might look more like Brazil in this graph. So I mentioned that we were cautiously optimistic about what was happening in Mexico, and you can see here fairly significant difference. More than 1 million barrels a day difference in the out period of our forecast. Almost 2 million barrels a day difference between the forecast from 2013 International Energy Outlook and the one that we just published for 2014. Natural gas plant liquids and biofuels make up the bulk of this category that we call other liquid fuels, and most of that is in natural gas plant liquids. So that's the material that looks a lot like condensates, that is being produced along with the increase in shale natural gas production, and in some cases from the oil shales as well. Almost 60% of the wells in the U.S. Tracked by the Energy Information Administration now produce both oil and gas. So it's actually very hard, in a sense, to separate what is an oil well from what is a gas well. Natural gas plant liquids, in our definition, generally tend to come from natural gas wells that going through where the wet gas goes through plants that separate the liquids portion of that gas stream from the dry gas or methane that gets put into the pipeline systems and shipped, long distances to become fuel for, homes, industry, and so on. This growth in natural gas plant liquids fairly strong, and a lot of that is coming because of this pickup in production that we're seeing, and a good part of that in the U.S. from the shales. One of the things that I think is worth looking at is how the tight oil production on a global basis looks. In our numbers, if you look in the early part there, almost all of the tight oil production around the world is coming from the United States. But as we get out into the period towards 2020 and beyond, an increasing amount of oil is expected to come from the tight formations around the world. Where this is happening already, Argentina, for example, and there are tight oil resources in a number of countries around the world. EIA did a big study on that about 1.5 years ago, and you could look at the numbers. There are tight oil resources in places like Russia, Argentina, Libya, and in a number of other countries around the world. The resource base is very strong. How economic that resource base is going to be remains to be seen. And it's taking a while, for example, for Argentina's efforts in this area to prove out, but they're up to something like 50,000 barrels a day of production from tight oil in Argentina today. We do see this spreading, as I indicated, Canada, potentially Mexico, Russia, a big holder of tight oil resources, Argentina, potentially China, and the rest of the world. One of the things that we're finding, and the reason for all of those dotted lines on the left-hand side here, is that using 2010 as the reference, which we are doing in the International Energy Outlook, kind of masks the fact that in 2013, 2014, 2015, if you just look at what the actual output is that we're expecting in 13, 14, and 15, we're way above those numbers already in the 2010 area. And in fact, by 2015, we could be at levels that are higher than what we would forecast for 2025 if we do indeed sort of peak and then begin to taper off and come down. This sort of lesson, I think, in how quickly this phenomenon has caught on, how impressive the improvements in technology have been, I think is just, to me, sets off a thought process that says that if the above ground conditions in policy in other countries like Mexico, Argentina, and elsewhere are good enough, the potential for those numbers to be higher than this is probably pretty strong. One of the other things that we did take a look at is we thought we would compare our numbers with the International Energy Agency's outlook as well as the OPEC World Oil Outlook. And our conclusion is that even in the base year, there are small differences, but they're pretty close. In the period out to 2035, which is as far out as the IEA forecast goes, there are some differences, and the difference seems to be mainly how much of the other liquid fuels exist in the IEA and OPEC forecasts relative to EIAs. We see more crude oil and a little bit less of the other liquid fuels, and in contrast, both OPEC World Oil Outlook and the IEA World Energy Outlook project lower numbers for crude, but somewhat higher numbers for the other liquid fuels. Okay, I think that I'm pretty close to the end, and I'll be happy to stay here as long as you want to do Q&A, but I wanted to finish up with this idea of what are the areas of uncertainty in the outlook. Certainly doing a forecast even to 2025, but one that goes as far as the year 2040 leaves a lot of opportunity to be wrong. And I thought that it would be useful to highlight some of the areas where we think the uncertainties are the greatest. The first one is, what really will China's energy demand growth look like, and especially in transportation? We actually have a special effort that we're making to better understand transportation fuel demand growth in China. We're trying to model that. We're working with a number of outside academics and consultants and trying to put a model together to actually build up a transportation outlook for China that is driven by things like behavior and vehicle miles traveled rather than a kind of a top-down approach based on economic activity. So a structural look at transportation demand in China, I think, will be very useful for informing the long-term outlook. The increasing global trade in natural gas and HGLs, so that's hydrocarbon gas liquids. Hydrocarbon gas liquids are things like natural gas plant liquids, refinery liquids, so it's kind of all the same thing. It's ethanes, propanes, butanes, those kinds of products. But the trade in that is really beginning to pick up, and we are trying to integrate our representation of that globally so that it makes sense. As I indicated in that prior slide, differences in those other liquids, and a lot of that is these hydrocarbon gas liquids, is an important differentiating point between IEA's and OPEC's forecasts and the EIA's, and we want to know more about that. Third area, global development of tight oil and shale gas resources. We're looking at geology, we're looking at everything we can to understand the technology and the cost structures associated with developing tight oil and shale gas resources. We're trying to take into account environmental issues that surround that from the standpoint of how the industry is addressing these issues and how that might influence growth. So we are very keen to understand better whether or not shale gas and shale oil development will really grow outside of the U.S. To the extent that we believe it will, that incremental 3 million barrels a day by 2025. But again, looking at the U.S. experience, it's very possible that those numbers could be larger than that, and that would have big implications for our outlook. And finally, we're trying to see if we can't come up with ways to model geopolitical issues within our outlook. Last year, in the 2013 International Energy Outlook, we actually had a write-up of how Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia might split up market share under our growth outlooks. Let me just explain that just a little bit. We looked at what we thought total world demand would be. We looked at non-OPEC supply, and that left, you know, some 36 or 37 million barrels a day of OPEC market share. And then we took off a number of barrels for all of the countries except for Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and that left and I think the number is something like 17 million barrels a day. So then what we tried to say was, well, look, how would you split 17, 20 million barrels a day of output between those three countries? If things go really well in Iran and really well in Iraq, for example, Saudi Arabia's market share could go as low as 6 or 7 million barrels a day. If things don't go well in Iran and Iraq, Saudi Arabia's market share might go as high as 15 or 16 million barrels a day in that kind of scenario. And we weren't trying to say how we thought it would actually work out, because honestly, we don't know. But it was, we thought, worth exploring what the range of market shares would be for these three key countries within OPEC under different circumstances. And we believe that the policymakers in those three countries are probably examining the same thing. So that's it. There's a bunch of places to go on our website to learn more about the EIA and the data that we have available. And if there's one thing that I could really steer you towards here, is to go to Today in Energy and get yourself signed up for the daily email push out on Today in Energy. They're timely, short, I believe very well and thoughtfully written essays on contemporary issues in energy data and analysis that cover a broad range of fuels. It's not just oil, you know, oil, gas, coal, renewables, nuclear, and so on. And it does a pretty good job, I think, of helping people stay informed about some of the key issues that EIA and U.S. citizens and others all around the world are struggling with every day. So thank you very much for that. And Jason, I'd be happy to do questions and answers.
When I said in the beginning how much great work you had done to expand and modernize EIA, I didn't even mention bringing back the International Energy Outlook, which was really important given some of the decisions that were made for budgetary reasons before at EIA, but how valuable it is to have this as a tool. And Today in Energy is at least on my syllabus, so you should get 35 or 40 new signups each year, at least, if not more. So I thought what I'd do, we'll take about a half hour for questions probably, because I know you have a busy day. Let me ask a couple just to get it going, and then I think we have a microphone over here, and if people can just come and stand by the microphone, we can take questions from people. I know there are a lot of people watching online, and people can submit questions online as well to @ColumbiaU Energy on Twitter, and the hashtag is CGEP events, CGEP, Center on Global Energy Policy events. So let me just ask a couple of things that came to my mind as I was listening to you. One, I was struck by the sources of future production, the amount of tight oil you expect to get outside North America, how much of that was coming from Russia, And the U.S. government, in the last 10 days or so, sanctioned the provision of technology and services to do tight oil, Arctic, and offshore. So can you talk a little bit about, A, how that plays in, that sort of thing plays into your forecasting, but what impact do you think those sanctions will have on the ability of Russia to grow its future production, which is the intended purpose of the sanctions, right? Not to affect oil markets today, because we all take a hit if you drive up prices, but to impose pain by affecting their future production capability.
Well, let me start off by saying that EIA is not a policy organization. We're one of the 14 federal statistical agencies, and Jason, I always like to think of myself as being one policy remark away from returning to the private sector.
Yeah, we're going to try to make that happen this morning.
So, yes, longer-term forecasts, could be impacted. We don't think that the impact of the sanctions would do much over the course of the next year or two. And I think one thing that I would say is I believe we could all hope that within a few years, the issues associated with imposition of sanctions and activities in the Ukraine would be settled. The sanctions would come off, and then EIA's long-term forecasts for Russian production would still hold. So I think that the answer to could our longer-term forecasts be impacted, the answer is yes. Do we have to do anything about that right now? Probably not.
And in the spirit of trying to get you back to the private sector, you showed the, you noted how every year, the actual production numbers continue to surprise to the upside relative to the formal reference case projections, how much the tight oil boom is really just continues to surpass many people's expectations. As you know, there's a debate going on about whether we should export oil. So I don't want to ask you that because that's a policy question. That's not what EIA does. But what thoughts can you share about sort of the impact, if we continue to surprise to the upside, what impact does that have on U.S. markets in terms of the ability of refiners to absorb more of that U.S. production?
So let's kind of divide your question up into two parts. One, what's driving the remarkable increases that we're seeing, and why have, it's not just EIA's forecasts, by the way, forecasts from, I think, many different consultants, academic groups, other government agencies, and so on, have all fallen short of what's actually happened. So why? And then secondly, what does that imply for domestic production and so on? So the first part of the question is, I think it's a little bit the resource base and improvements in our understanding of the resource base. But I think the biggest factor has been the rapid improvements in the technology of both drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Well productivity, or drilling rig productivity, has gone way up. So rigs that could only drill, one well every 3 months are now drilling, 3 or 4 times as many wells. They're doing it from directionally from the same platform, and so the ability of a smaller number of gas rigs, for example, the gas rig count has dropped substantially, but gas production has continued to climb because, among other things, the gas rigs are more productive in drilling wells. The second aspect of this is the improvements in the productivity of the wells themselves, I think driven in part by carving up the horizontal section of the wells into smaller or larger number of segments. So multi-segment hydraulic fracturing, rather than trying to fracture at one time the entire horizontal well length, they're being carved into smaller sections, and it's easier to control those sections and increase the productivity of the fracturing process itself. Some of the other things that are going on is more water per stage or segment of fracturing is being used, along with more sand. So the tons of sand used in each 200, 250 foot length of fractured segment is rising. So if you thought about the area around the wellbore, the fracturing or the cracks are spreading out further, which then exposes more of the reservoir to production. That has a kind of a dual impact of lowering the cost and increasing the output all at the same time. And I think that's what's driving this. I want to mention, by the way, that two secretaries of energy, Secretary Chu and Secretary Moniz, have convened panels, the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, to look at all of the impacts associated with hydraulic fracturing, and the conclusion of two of these boards that have very broad representation of academics, environmentalists, industry people, consultants, and others, is that hydraulic fracturing is compatible with environmental goals, that although there are problems that can come up with hydraulic fracturing, that in general those problems are manageable, and that in general the benefits of continuing with that outweigh the costs. Keeping that in mind, the next question is, so if natural gas production and oil production continues to rise, what are we going to do with it all? What are you going to do with it? Your question was on oil. Let's stick with that for just a second. So the first thing that's happened is U.S. imports of the light sweet crude, which is being produced by these shale formations, the Bakken in North Dakota, the Eagle Ford in South and West Texas, the Permian Basin in Texas, is replacing light sweet crude oil imports. So imports have declined very dramatically in the U.S. over the past 3 or 4 years. We may be getting closer to a point where we have replaced all of the light sweet imports that can be replaced, particularly in the Gulf Coast area, and that means something else might have to happen. The light sweet crude has to be transported to refineries either in the East Coast or the West Coast, probably by rail, at least initially, to replace imported oil in the East and the West. Another possibility is more of that oil finding its way into the Texas Gulf Coast area, starts at some point to bottleneck refineries, and something has to happen with it. Just recently, the Commerce Department issued a ruling that said the very lightest of these light sweet crudes, the condensate portion, if it was processed through a distillation tower, would be eligible for exports, and so some of that has started. When I first joined EIA 2.5 years ago, I indicated that it would not be inconceivable that policymakers might want to think about things like swaps of oil. Mexico would be an interesting example. Mexico has heavy crudes that would be very useful in the Gulf Coast refineries. Some of the Mexican refineries could run very well on some of these light sweet crudes, and finding some way to swap oil with Mexico might make a lot of sense from a policy standpoint. I'm not recommending that to anybody. I'm just saying that it's something that policymakers, I think, ultimately might be confronted with, because I just see it as kind of a natural progression of how the market would react to the opportunities that are available. Crude oil can already be exported to Canada, and we are seeing increased shipments of U.S. crude oil to East Coast Canadian refineries. Some U.S. oil might be making its way into the Sarnia refineries in Canada. So it's another outlet for some of this. Whether we get to the point where you hit a wall that U.S. Production just keeps climbing and there's no place for that light sweet crude to go without finding further exits would depend on a lot of things, including how quickly refiners are able to ramp up with changes in their own configurations to handle some of the light sweet crudes. And there are already a number of refinery projects underway right now and others that are being planned to deal with this. So it's kind of a tug of war between how quickly changes can be made in domestic refining configurations versus how quickly the light sweet crude oil production is growing.
And just on the Mexico question, I'll just mention the question of how feasible swaps are, how much could be taken in that way, how much of an impact the current reforms will have on production. We're really excited that Adrien Lejeune is here this semester as a fellow, the former CEO of Pemex, and there's a paper on the center's website. It speaks to some of these questions. There'll be more work coming from Adrien over the course of the year. And maybe you have a question or comment for Adam as well. But just, because we're doing the international energy outlook, the last question I wanted to ask you about that is how the gas and oil kind of get lumped together a little bit, but gas, as you know, is different. There's not a single global market the way there is for oil. The U.S. is not most likely going to be a net exporter of oil the way it probably will be for gas. How important is this debate we're having in this country to the global oil market?
The way the global oil market would be impacted would be that to the extent that U.S. supplies would be incremental to global demand, it would allow OPEC spare capacity to remain higher than it would otherwise be, and relatively high OPEC spare capacity in the past has generally been associated with periods of price stability or even somewhat lower prices in the global markets. Anything that adds to supply relative to demand in the global markets presumably would have some impact in terms of lowering prices by a little bit. I don't think it would be huge. There have been a number of studies done looking at LNG as well and the impact of U.S. LNG exports on global prices. It's very difficult to ascertain all of this. In general, I think that the conclusions have been it would tend to either lower slightly or keep prices from rising more than they otherwise would. The biggest impacts generally tend to be on GDP, that more domestic production and exports tend to improve economic growth in the U.S. and improve the trade balance, all of which results in overall economic activity being higher. One of the things that I think that a lot of the studies have shown is that the changes in economic activity, although they're positive, tend to be modest because the global economy is very big and oil or even natural gas trade is relatively small. That's not to say that because it's small, policymakers shouldn't consider it. Almost anything that you do in the economy that tends to increase GDP and create jobs and so on is very small. The journey is a lot of steps, and each of those steps is probably important. Coming back to the oil area, EIA is working on a number of studies that we hope to have out before the end of the year that will address some of the key issues in these export questions. We will have a paper, for example, examining how product prices are set in the U.S. Are they more related to the global markets or to the U.S. Domestic markets? Is gasoline really driven by Brent crude oil rather than WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude oil prices? How is gasoline related to, in the U.S., how is it related to gasoline prices in places like Singapore and Rotterdam? And in a month or two, we should have that study out. And I think the statistical effort that we're making in this is very rigorous, and I think it will help policymakers understand how the pricing of gasoline in the U.S. is set, and that's one of the key issues that I think people are struggling with. If you allow crude oil exports, what does it do to gasoline prices?
So I hope people will come and stand at the microphone. I'll let you ask one more question while we're doing that. I have a question from Twitter, which I'm looking at on my watch, and the Apple Watch is not even out yet. I think it's really cool. And the question is, what are the greenhouse gas consequences of the projections that you just showed us? I mean, I presume these are the reference cases. You're not modeling a carbon policy scenario, but where does that leave us for climate change?
Yeah, we have estimates for greenhouse gases from energy-related activities in the International Energy Outlook. We also track that pretty closely for the United States in our annual energy outlook. Because of the growth in coal consumption in Asia, greenhouse gas emissions are likely to climb very strongly over the period from 2010 or now out to 2040. The U.S. contribution to that growth is very small, and under a number of circumstances, such as the potential extension of fuel efficiency standards for automobiles and a few other demand-side things that could occur in the U.S., more switching to natural gas from coal, continuing use of nuclear power plants, continuing growth in non-carbon renewables, all of that could lead to actual declines in the U.S. portion of greenhouse gas emissions. And the real challenge, I think, will be to come up with ways to have a global agreement that deals with growth in energy consumption that appears likely to continue in the developing world.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, you sort of hear talk of peak oil, not because we're going to run out, but because demand might peak as in response to higher prices, and alternatives will just economically make more sense. I mean, is that something you see as feasible?
Well, it's certainly true for the United States, and it's probably true for the OECD countries. But as you recall that graph that we had of oil, liquid fuels demand growth in China, a lot of that driven by transportation increases, commercial vehicles, private vehicles. It's going to be very difficult to see oil demand peaking in the near term. And in fact, as I said, our longer term projections, we have oil demand rising from, you know, it's in the range of 91 million barrels a day or so today to 119 million barrels a day by 2040. So we do not see, even in the globally out to 2040, we don't see a peaking in demand. That could change if policies change in a number of countries. So higher market-based prices for petroleum fuels in a number of countries, Middle East and Latin America, Asia, would be a key step, I think, towards moving towards the scenario that you've outlined, Jason.
So folks could just quickly identify themselves.
Good morning. I'm Chuck Samuel from the New York and Atlantic Railway. We're part of a consortium of 6 shortland railroads around the United States. And I can honestly tell you that no one was caught more by surprise of the volume of crude moving by rail than the railroads themselves. To use a bit of railroad humor, we were sleeping at the switch while this was going on. Now, not having read the article that Jason suggested, I believe was earlier in the Wall Street Journal, I just wonder if you have any sense as to where you feel the rail by crude is going, because from what I hear from the people on the Class 1s, it's just continuing to grow, and they don't know how big it's going to get.
So one of the things that in the Wall Street Journal article today, there was a slight misinterpretation of the numbers. They mentioned 1.6 million barrels a day of crude moving by rail. That's actually the total that EIA is estimating for just about now on crude plus products. So petroleum products moving by rail, 1.6 million barrels a day. If you look back at the period between 2000 and 2006 or 7, about 600,000 barrels a day of petroleum products were moving around the country, very little crude oil on the rail, so mostly products. Since that time frame, the growth has been mostly crude oil. So I estimate that the current amount of crude oil moving around on rail in the U.S. is close to 1 million barrels a day, not the 1.6 that was mentioned on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. But 1 million barrels a day growth over the last few years is a big number. A lot of that is coming from the Bakken in North Dakota, because North Dakota was off of the main track of petroleum pipelines coming out of the traditional producing areas like Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, California. The oil there pretty much stays in California. Alaskan oil coming through the Alaskan pipeline generally finds its way down to California. So the big change is that oil from Texas and Louisiana was not making its way north anymore to refineries in the mid-continent and east, as much as we now have crude oil moving from North Dakota south, east, and west, and maybe even some of it going up into Canada. That growth is one of the reasons for it is rail is very flexible. You can pick it up closer to where the production is coming from. You can deliver it to those refineries that can handle the light sweet crudes, and that has a big advantage over pipelines that generally have a fixed start point and a fixed end point and require very large capital investment and the commitment of the shippers to build the pipelines. Jason might want to comment on this, but there's still a lot of crude oil and product pipelines being built in the U.S., so it's not that we're not doing it, it's just that the growth in production and the refining utilization rise in terms of products coming from running crude oil through our refineries is kind of running faster than the ability of pipelines to keep up with it. Did you want to?
No, I don't want to take time away from questions. I mean, there are some high-profile examples like Keystone of where things have gotten, to use a pun, bottled up as a result of government permitting and stuff. But those are the exception more than I think the rule. And capital markets have responded, and the amount of investment that's come into the midstream has been huge in the last few years. I won't ask you to comment on what impact the Jones Act has on that, because we really do want you to keep your job. So, but we take the next question.
Hi, my name is Max Pujor. I have 4 questions, and I apologize, but they all arose out of your presentation here.
If they're very fast.
Okay, first one is regarding your, it seems that the data that you're providing us is generated by the model. The caveats that you presented at the end, the last one was political instability. It seems that political instability should play a greater role in your particular model, especially given what's going on. On the demand side, you just had the Scottish referendum. You have European fragmentation. On the supply side, you have the rise of 2 geopolitical hegemons. China, in particular, in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine and regionally, threatening Kazakhstan, already having threatened Turkmenistan, et cetera. So that's the first question. Second one is you discussed OPEC, and you discussed Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And it seemed that the way you presented it was as a piece of a pie rather than each component growing. The capacity for Iran is about 6 million barrels, 2.5 to 2.9 now. Iraq would jump up to 12. So it seems rather than apportioning the pie, you could go, if you have political stability, you could go out to an extreme number. Third question, you brought up condensate in different areas. You specifically spoke about lease condensate, but in the world accounting, OPIC accounts for lease and plant condensate together, whereas the EIA, as Jason has always suggested, we should pay attention to the EIA website. Lease condensate is shown as a separate line item from plant liquids, in particular plant condensate. Somehow those two have to be lumped together because in the end, you deliver them to the same three markets. And last question is on shale. Your assumptions on shale. You say you're going out to 3 million barrels, and you're only seeing 50K coming out of Argentina. I assume that's...
Well, that's current production in Argentina.
Okay, right. But, you know, Argentina is a confounding market. Some people say it's corrupt. I prefer to say it's just it's regulatory challenged. But so the things that prevents exploration and production in places like Vaca Muerta in Argentina is the regulatory environment, allowing return on investment to accrue to the producers. Anyway, so that's the 4 areas.
There was a question on Twitter as well about sort of how you account for geopolitical risk in these models. I know you spoke about that a little bit, but that's sort of related to the first question the gentleman asked, so maybe you could speak to that.
Well, that's really hard to do. We've actually had a workshop just after our annual conference, the EIA annual conference that we had in mid-July. We had a special 3-hour workshop after the conference to try to gather views from analysts, academics, and industry practitioners on how we might incorporate geopolitics into a model. You know, some of it you might be able to do in a number of different ways. I think ultimately what you end up doing is I think just trying different scenarios, a scenario approach, and then you try to figure out what those scenarios mean. Let me just quickly go through some of these questions. The forecasts generally come obviously from the model. The data in the international area is not as good as the data that we have in the United States, and we're trying to make some improvements. We're starting first with Canada and Mexico. EIA has an effort underway to try to work with Canadian and Mexican company and government people to improve the comparability of U.S., Canadian, and Mexican energy data. And we would love to extend that to elsewhere to Latin America, just as an example. But getting something going on North American energy data comparability is something that's actually pretty high on our priority list. Factoring in geopolitics, I think, again, the best way to do that is scenarios on OPEC. Well, that's essentially what we did. And what we said was Iran might get up to 6 or 7 million barrels a day. Iraq might get to 9 million barrels a day, probably not 12 in our forecast. And given overall levels of world demand and other supplies, if you had called that the high case for Iran and Iraq, that would lead to potentially lower market share for Saudi Arabia. If you didn't get those successful outcomes in Iran and Iraq, then Saudi market share would go higher, and that just is a scenario. How that would actually work out, trying to be very specific about forecasting it, I'm not really sure what the value is, other than saying that things would be different. On condensates, I absolutely agree with you that that's an important one. Some of this is just for historic reasons. You know, I started off the Q&A period saying that EIA is a statistical agency. We count things, right? That's what we're supposed to do. In the early days of EIA, somebody, a bunch of our people went out into the oil and gas fields, and they said, okay, so we want to count this material, how should we do it? And what we discovered was that lease condensate, so condensates generally coming from natural gas, but sometimes coming from an oil and combined oil and gas production. If there was no takeaway capacity to go into the natural gas stream, that is to go to a natural gas plant, to have the gas plant liquids taken out there and the dry gas then shipped on further, what they would do with the condensate was put it back into the crude stream. So we started counting crude and least condensate as crude oil because it went into the crude pipeline and went to the refinery. And when it got to the refinery said, this is how many barrels we have, right? And so that was the reason. The material that went to a gas plant, in the inlet stream to one of these gas plants, gas liquid separation facilities, you would get the same material as you indicated, ethanes, propanes, butanes, falling out, condensing, and that would get picked up and go out in a different way in many cases than the least condensate was going. It didn't go into the dry gas pipeline network, but it went on to buyers some other way. So how we were defining least condensate and natural gas plant liquids really was just a measurement issue. That's where it was, and that's how we counted it. Well, now it turns out that with more and more wells producing both oil and gas, with some of those condensates being separated out from the crude oil stream and being processed at the field or somewhere else, it's become more important to understand that, and we are working with parts of Homeland Security and the Commerce Department to get numbers to track the exports of this processed condensate material so that we'll know how much there is. Whether or not we could ever combine the two, because they chemically they look very similar, will depend a lot on again, just the counting, the accounting issues that are associated with measuring the material and making sure that you're tracking it all. There are all kinds of other issues, and let me just briefly mention what condensate is up in the air. What a refinery is and what a distillation tower and how you define distillation is another issue that didn't seem to matter 3 or 4 years ago, but matters now because of some of the regulatory rulings that are coming out. So EIA will adjust, and we'll try to find ways to define these things in ways that most people can agree on, and then present the data. It's not going to be easy, and I would welcome your comments on it.
It is interesting that that Iran can export condensate because the sanctions don't treat it as crude oil, but the U.S. can't.
Right. So the last question in 30 seconds on shale. I think that what's going to happen with shale outside the United States, even inside the United States, is largely an above-ground issue. What are the regulatory and policy considerations associated with hydraulic fracturing and access to land and capital formation issues that will determine how quickly it moves outside the United States. Yes, sir.
Adrian's been waiting patiently.
I'm Adrian Lajoux from CGEP. The hydrocarbon integration of North America has been evolving very rapidly, and there's important new patterns of this integration, and I believe this will go further in the near future. Having said this, I find it very interesting that you're looking in more detail at the statistics both for Canada and for Mexico. So I am convinced that a North American focus is warranted, and not only a U.S.-centered focus. And this is important, and your own numbers show it. You have the U.S. peaking, production peaking, but if you add Canada and Mexico, the same numbers that you use, that is not the case. So I think the stats are important, the focus is important, and that we would all be well served by the EIA looking more deeply into at least the numbers, but also the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely agree with you. We think it's very important for lots of different reasons, and even beyond trying to line up the statistics. One of the really interesting areas that would be of just as much interest to Canada and Mexico as the U.S. is the export numbers. When oil comes from Alberta into the U.S., Canada reports the numbers as the amount of crude oil actually going out, but they don't include the diluent as part of the line. The U.S. numbers include the diluent, and trying to figure out that, I think, would be really beneficial. I think all three countries probably have an interest in better understanding rail transportation. The first question on crude by rail, very important in Canada, and probably will be important in Mexico as well. And perhaps we could make progress on understanding those numbers so that we could offer policymakers at least some idea as to the extent of it, the directions that the crude and products are traveling, what the forecasts are for growth in the future, and so on. Lots of opportunities, I think, for cooperation between Canada, Mexico, and the United States on this, and I'm really looking forward to EIA helping out with the data and analytical portion of these issues. Thank you.
Let's take these last two questions, and then we'll try to let you out a few minutes early.
Hi, I'm Claire Lee, and I'm a graduate student in Columbia. I was working as an energy trader in China last year. So there are several pretty big movements that Chinese government trying to do in the energy sector. They're the two largest I have been through. The first one is they just opened the importing rights to the individual refineries. Like most 90% of refineries, we call it spot refineries in China, and the operating rates for them has been like below 30% for many years because they couldn't get access to crude oil. So once the government opened that, I believe the demand is going to change a lot for the Chinese data. And the second one, the Chinese trying to launch a new benchmark besides WTI and Brent. Mm-hmm. So they just launched the oil exchange in the free trade zone, and they are going to launch the oil futures very soon. So I want to know, what's your opinion on these movements that Chinese government trying to make or is making, and how it's going to affect the global market, the pricing and the landscapes? Thank you.
Well, thank you for those questions and pointing out what's happening with some of the trading activity. So China is the other country that EIA would like to work more closely with on data issues, and we've actually begun a process of dialogue with two of the main groups in China that are involved in collecting energy statistics. And hopefully that will move along as well. Let me just jump quickly to the issue of a benchmark, which I think to me has always been a fascinating issue. Why is West Texas Intermediate a benchmark? Why is Brent the benchmark? Why has it been difficult to get crude oil benchmarks actively traded in other parts of the world? And I think there's like four main reasons, and some of these I think can be overcome. First of all, you need volumes of oil that can be traded. So you actually, it helps if you've got production in the North Sea, production in Texas to create the physical basis for trading. So trading activity is not all just pure financial speculative activity. There are plenty of independent producers, for example, that try to hedge forward their production in order to get capital to continue with drilling programs. So having volumes of crude oil is very important. Second thing is currency. When you're involved in trading activities, you'd like to have it in a currency that you have faith that it isn't going to change around on you and complicate, add further risk to the trading activity itself. And the dollar has often been viewed, not always, but often viewed as a fairly stable trading currency. And so it's not a surprise in many ways that Brent and WTI, which trade in dollars, have become a benchmark. The third out of these four areas is law. Whenever trading activity takes place, inevitably there will be disputes, and the disputes have to be resolved in the courts, and it's very important to have trust that the legal system will be impartial in adjudicating whatever the disputes are. And then the final one is access to trading capital. The WTI contract actually trades in New York. The Brent contract trades in London. London and New York are the two very largest of the financial centers around the world, and they have the ability to provide the other side, the financial side of the physical trade. So if you're going to have another benchmark somewhere, it really helps to have all four of these things working. I think that the currency in China has actually shown itself to be pretty stable. The access to capital, I think, is pretty good. How the legal representation would work, I don't really know. I'm not an expert in that, but it's certainly plausible to me that something could be worked out there. And then the volumes would be another question. So what physical oil would actually be traded would be another issue. A number of countries have tried to create benchmarks, and they failed for one reason or another because of something going wrong in one of those four key areas. But the ability of China, I think, to overcome some of those issues and maybe come up with a benchmark seems to me to be a reasonable thing, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens.
Last question.
Hi. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Jing, and I'm a reporter at Bloomberg News. I just wanted to ask a little bit about condensate exports. It seems that from the numbers that you've been gathering, they've kind of been up, and we just wanted to figure out, so what's increasing here? As far as we know, that only two companies with licenses, they're exporting condensates, but that's considered a refined product. So if you could provide some clarification on that, that would be great. Thanks.
Right. So to the best of my knowledge, the current classification of the processed condensate exports that were authorized, or in a sense deemed to be products by the Commerce Department, fall into, are currently being tracked in a middle distillate category. And EIA has been working with others in Washington to try to see if we can't get a separate category for that material so that we can better understand how much of it there is. One of the things that we did look at was in the Eagle Ford formation, how much of this material we think that there actually is that, if it were processed through a distillation tower, might qualify to be exported. Is kind of in a low case is somewhere near 100,000 barrels a day, and a higher case maybe 400,000 barrels a day. You don't have the same kind of material anywhere else. I mean, basically this is coming from this very high API gravity portions of the Eagle Ford formation. There isn't nearly as much of it. There may be condensates that would qualify in places like the Permian Basin and some other, maybe even the Bakken, but it's further away from the coasts, and to be exported, it has to be kept separate from other fuels, and that might require different modes of transportation than currently exist, and so it slows down the whole process. We don't actually have a number on what this is at this point because it's being mixed in with other products. And we hope to kind of have that sorted out fairly quickly so that policymakers will at least know what the numbers are. And analysts who, would like to make, forecasts would also, probably benefit from this. One of the things that we are working on, we are getting closer and closer to having approval to begin to do our own survey, EIA's own survey of wellhead oil production. And we will have the API gravity of that production as one of the items on our survey. That would help, I think, to put into some perspective what the various breakdowns are of the heavy, medium, and light and ultralight crude oil streams once we begin to collect that data. And I think that there's a pretty good chance we will actually put that program in place early next year and have the first publication of it sometime towards mid-year of 2015.
And as part of the answer to her question about why condensate exports might be going up, even though only 2 classification rulings, Canada, I mean, we've seen condensate exports rising for a while, even before the classification rulings.
Right, but I mean, certainly in EIA's numbers, we have crude oil and condensate. We don't.
Right, right.
So we are also working, one of the other things that we're working on, it might lead to at least an ability to triangulate on the answer to your question is sometime in early November, I hope that EIA will have a tool available on our website that will make it very easy to look at both imports and exports of crude oil by API gravity.
Well, thanks for all you're doing to keep EIA so helpful to all of us, and thanks for being with us here today. So please join me in thanking Adam Sieminski.
Thank you, Jason.